Okay.
Just wanted to say hello to Blaine. Hi, Blaine. Welcome.
Hi, Blaine.
Hi.
So, welcome to this first meeting of this new webinar series, jointly organized by the RFI Research Center on Virtues and the Mind&Ethics group. We're very pleased to start this year's series with Matt Stichter, a person whose work we really like, who's an expert in moral psychology, virtue ethics, and the virtue as skill thesis. You're probably all familiar with his latest book, whose cover is in the first slide he's sharing with us, The Skillfulness of Virtue. And we are really happy to have him sharing his views on skillfulness and virtue. And I just wanted to mention that this year's webinar series is also part of a curiosity-driven grant, and I need to thank publicly the European Union and my institution, the University of Genova, for granting me this for this grant. Sorry. And so, without further ado, I give the floor to Matt. And thanks, Matt, for accepting our invitation.
Well, thank you, Maria Silvia, and the RT Center again for inviting me. I'm very honored. Thank you, everyone, for attending. So I will apologize a little bit in advance, just because I have a little script I have to read, because it's the only possible way to keep me on time. So I'll read while entertaining you with the slideshow. So in this talk, I'm going to elaborate some details of an account of wisdom based on my philosophical account of virtue as skill and its grounding in self-regulatory and goal-oriented theories in psychology and cognitive science. I'll further discuss how this compares and contrasts to both the common wisdom model discussed by Grossman and a rival account of wisdom based on Aristotelian phronesis proposed by Christensen. And then I'll focus on resolving two areas of contention between those models, one accounting for moral motivation by drawing on goal theory, and the role of emotion and wisdom by suggesting an activist approach. I've argued elsewhere that virtue is best conceptualized and operationalized as a skill in that book. And this book grounds that in the broader framework of self-regulation in psychology. That framework has not only changed my approach to virtue overall, but it's also allowed me to connect discussions of virtue to a variety of topics in moral psychology. But it's important at the start to be clear about what I'm referring to when I discuss self-regulation. So theories of self-regulation explain how systems regulate their actions according to goals. Carver and Shearer's control theory explains this in terms of the dynamics of a negative feedback loop, by which the system attempts to reduce discrepancies between the existing state and the goal state. This involves monitoring one's environment, comparing the existing state to the goal state, and if there's a discrepancy, then there's an action the system can take to move towards the goal state, and so on. This goal-directed view of self-regulation applies to such diverse systems as humans, animals, and machines, even simple technology like a thermostat and regulating the temperature of the room, say, to be above 70 degrees. Bandura's social cognitive approach builds on this model by explaining the greater complexity involved with human self-regulation. While humans can strive for goals with great sophistication, a crucial element to account for is that we can choose to adopt new goals for ourselves, a process of discrepancy production, where such goals aren't adopted merely as a means to achieving a pre-existing goal. For example, if you decide that you would like to learn how to play the guitar, then in adopting such a goal, you're putting yourself into a new state of disequilibrium with respect to this goal. This provides you with motivation to take actions to reach that goal, for example, take guitar lessons, to reduce this new discrepancy you've given yourself. It's important to highlight, though, that the dynamics of discrepancy reduction won't account for how some goals get set in the first place. So, for example, can't explain how the thermometer got set to 70, or for how we come to set new goals which produce, rather than reduce, discrepancies. Now, some goals for humans spring from common biological, psychological, and social needs, but there are a variety of ways we can meet these needs, and we can also choose to adopt goals that may not be directly related to such needs. On Bandura's account, two main factors relevant to goal setting are the desirability and feasibility of a goal. A goal is a desired or valued state of affairs which one aims to achieve, and so desirability is a concern with how valuable it would be to achieve the goal, whereas feasibility is a concern about how likely one is to achieve it, so includes self-efficacy beliefs. Goals can include adopting standards of behavior that one wants to live by, including moral standards. As such, while some goals may be temporary, others might be enduring, like wanting to be an honest person. Well, if you're committed to a goal, then you will have some motivation to take action to achieve it. And this taking action marks a transition from goal setting to goal striving. This distinction is important as deciding whether to commit to a goal in the first place or whether to maintain commitment to an existing goal involves different considerations and processes from the activities associated with striving to achieve a goal, like planning and acting. This distinction is captured here by the Rubicon model of action phases, where phases 1 and 4 are concerned with goal setting considerations and motivation, and phases 2 and 3 are concerned with goal striving and volition. Insofar as you're weighing considerations about the desirability or feasibility of a goal, whether in terms of adopting a new goal or changing an existing goal, this is a process of goal setting. If you're thinking instead about how best to achieve a goal, where the goal itself is not in question, then you're engaging in processes of goal striving. This is a significant distinction when it comes to what kind of cognitive processes and strategies will be useful to each endeavor. Finally, taking action to achieve a goal can provide us with feedback in the fourth phase, which then loops back to earlier phases. Not only can we get feedback for future goal striving in terms of whether the actions we took were effective in reaching our goal, or if not, coming up with different plans, but also feedback in terms of the desirability and the feasibility of the goal itself. Now, some goals we set for ourselves may be relatively straightforward to achieve, even if they take multiple steps or quite a bit of time to accomplish, say, having a New Year's resolution to go to the gym 100 days in a row. But often we have goals where what we value is being able to perform competently in a complex domain, such as being a good musician, athlete, scientist, firefighter, chess player, etc. And such goals will amount to acquiring and exercising skills. The process of skill acquisition enables you to learn how to act well in a domain of great complexity by handling that complexity in incremental stages, by progressively developing your abilities. So there will be a progression of difficulty in the sub-goals that you strive to accomplish, such that once the initial difficult tasks become easy, you're then in a position to tackle the next most difficult task. So, like once you've learned how to shift gears when driving a car, then you can start practicing parallel parking. Ellen Fridland draws attention to this when she defines skills, quote, as a subclass of abilities which are characterized by the fact that they are refined or developed as a result of effortful attention and control to the skill itself, end quote. Now, skill involves some flexibility in how one strives to perform well, to cope with changes in one's environment, which is part of what makes a domain complex, as well as a broad view of the goal of the skill itself. So learning how to speak a language rather than memorizing a few useful phrases. Through experience and deliberate practice, we are building mental models of the domain we're acting in. So Green as Vito helpfully defined mental models as, quote, cognitive representations that include the declarative, procedural, and inferential knowledge necessary to understand how a complex system functions. Mental models go beyond definitions and rote learning to include a deep understanding of the component processes of the system and the ability to make inferences about changes to the system. Models provide us with control because they involve a fundamental understanding of how a system functions and why experiences are the way they are. This understanding then enables us to make predictions about the future states of the system, but without necessarily basing those predictions on past experience or mere pattern recognition. Instead, those predictions can be based on our understanding of the function and principles governing how the system works. As such, models also provide us with flexibility because modeling allows us to take into account the relevant features of a situation in order to more accurately predict potential outcomes, even in novel situations. One more aspect of goals that's important to highlight is that our goals are hierarchically organized, as I've tried to illustrate roughly here. A highly complex or abstract goal, such as a superordinate goal, will give rise to more context-specific subsidiary goals. The relationship between the differing levels on the hierarchy need not be merely one of a means to an end, though, as sometimes the lower-ordered goals provide the constituent elements of the higher-ordered goals. For example, this is how many virtue theorists view the relationship between flourishing and the virtues. Acting virtuously is not regarded as mere means to the end of living a flourishing life, but rather virtuous activity is partially constitutive of what it is to live well. As Carver and Scherer explain, in this hierarchical organization of goals, quote, the output of a high-level system consists of the resetting of the reference values at the next lower level of abstraction. Or to put it differently, higher-order systems behave by providing goals to the systems just below them. The reference values are more concrete and restricted as one moves from higher to lower levels. Each level regulates a quality that contributes to, though not entirely defining, the quality controlled at the next higher level. So, quote, So for example, as I've tried to illustrate here, being honest contributes to living well, though of course it doesn't entirely define it. And avoiding deception can be seen as contributing to being honest, but again, doesn't entirely define it, and so on. This moving from higher ordered abstract goals to lower ordered, more concrete goals serves at least two purposes. First, the greater specification in lower ordered goals provides better action guidance in specific situations. Second, and relatedly, you'll receive more direct feedback from the actions that you take. Now, because of the crucial role feedback plays in self-regulation, it's important that our goals are specified in ways that enable apt feedback on how we're doing. For example, in having a superordinate goal of living a flourishing life, we can't expect to receive much direct feedback on how we're doing with respect to that goal from actions that we take on a day-to-day basis. One problem is that the target is quite broad, which will make it difficult to determine what counts as success in a specific context with respect to that long-term goal of living well. Also, the speed at which you receive feedback matters in addition to the frequency and quality of the feedback. So it would be difficult to receive timely feedback as to how your actions in the moment contribute to living your life well on the whole, as the consequences of such actions could be a long time coming. So we need more approximate sub-goals that are constituent of the aim of living a flourishing life by which to guide routine action, and virtues would be some of those sub-goals. Now, our conceptions of these virtues will likely require some further specification. So honesty could involve sub-goals of keeping promises and avoiding deception and so on, in order to give us better precision in striving for these constitutive sub-goals. Now, so far I've discussed processes involved with self-regulation and skill acquisition that can account for the basics of regulating our behavior according to moral standards, even with complex moral goals such as virtues. To understand the place of wisdom in these processes of self-regulation, it will be helpful to return to the previous points about goal setting and discrepancy production. Goal setting involves questions of desirability and feasibility. With feasibility, you're concerned with the challenges inherent in realizing the goal itself and your own ability to meet those challenges. In other words, you're assessing how well you expect to be able to reduce the discrepancy that comes with committing yourself to a goal. And in this respect, there may be some overlap with aspects of goal striving that you might be trying to pre-plan how things might go in advance. However, those considerers of discrepancy reduction won't address the dimension of the desirability of a goal, and so other considerations will be relevant to this dimension of goal setting and discrepancy production. A similar point applies to setting virtuous goals. Why is it that we claim that we ought to aspire to be honest, kind, or just? Well, it's not merely because it's feasible to do so, as it's also feasible to be dishonest, cruel, or unjust. Importantly, it's because of the relationship to the desired value of the higher ordered goal of living a flourishing life. It's from considerations of what a flourishing life consists in that we can arrive at judgment that it partially consists in being honest and kind and just. Furthermore, the specific conceptions or reference values of those individual virtues are being set, ideally, in a way that makes them integrated, insofar as they're being jointly set by reference to that same higher ordered goal of flourishing. So if honesty and kindness are constituent of living well, then conceptions of those virtues should be shaped in the light of their shared contributions to living well. This connects to a traditional role assigned to practical wisdom in helping to unify the virtues in terms of integrating conceptions of virtue with one another, and by doing so by reference to a shared knowledge of what living well consists in. But how do we do well in making value judgments about what a flourishing life consists in? This is what I take to be a unique function for wisdom to carry out. Like, wisdom involves primarily processes of goal setting and discrepancy production, specifically regarding the superordinate goal of living well and the constitutive virtues. So I think wisdom involves refining or revising our conceptions of these, as well as integrating our non-moral goals and practices with these broader conceptions and concerns. Presumably, the cultural and social environment in which we're raised already furnishes us with some initial ideas about what living well consists in and what moral standards we should be guided by. However, even if one reliably integrates one's goals and activities with these initial conceptions, this won't be sufficient for flourishing or virtue, as one's inherited views of these may be mistaken. So part of the function of wisdom is to critically reflect on and refine these inherited conceptions of flourishing and virtue, to help ensure that these superordinate goals have been set appropriately, and which in turn impacts the subsidiary goals. So the other related function of wisdom is to guide decisions about what other non-moral goals to set for yourself, specifying what those goals consist in, how valuable those goals are relative to other goal commitments, and how those goals and their associated practices can be integrated with one another. And all that being carried out by reference to one's conception of living well and associated moral standards. Again, these higher order goals are basically helping to set the reference values for these lower order goals. Now, while wisdom is central for refining our understanding of living well in the virtues, success in realizing these virtuous aspirations in our daily life depends upon general self-regulatory abilities and on one's degree of development with respect to the various virtues. Another way to mark this distinction in the functions of wisdom and the moral virtues is in terms of their success conditions. So I think what counts as a form of success in exercising wisdom would be that you've made apt judgments regarding the value and conception of a goal. So getting it right with respect to what you're aiming to achieve. For example, aiming for responsible loyalty, not blind loyalty. Whereas success in the exercise of a moral virtue would be then realizing that goal in practice. That is, successfully hitting the target as picked out by wisdom. I think wisdom in this sense involves metacognition, at least in the sense that exercising wisdom involves reflection on your beliefs or flourishing in virtue, which befits wisdom's traditional categorization as an intellectual virtue. This focus on metacognitive processes has also become a point of consensus in two recent models of wisdom. The common wisdom model that was developed by Grossman and a group of psychologists and social scientists who were all studying wisdom, and the Aristotelian phronesis model that was developed by Christensen and other philosophers at the Jubilee Center for Character and Virtues, and as well as in collaboration with some psychologists such as Blaine. Now, so I think there's a lot of convergence in these models, which is great, but there are some points of divergence, which is what I'm going to be sort of focusing on. You might think that the common wisdom model sort of is underspecified, and so you'll see elements of that dialectic here when comparisons get made between these two. So, common wisdom model, or the CWM. According to this model, quote, central to wisdom are aspects of perspectival metacognition, which are grounded in moral aspirations and specific socio-cultural contexts and experiences, end quote. While the grounding in moral aspirations is a reference to moral standards in general, they also recognize that talk of aspirations draws a connection to virtue theory in particular, noting that, quote, from the virtue ethical perspective, key moral characteristics scholars associate with wisdom, such as orientation towards shared humanity, pursuit of truth, balance of self-protection, other orientation, as well as common good orientation, represent aspirational goals for a better life rather than prescriptions, end quote. Also, their reference to socio-cultural context and experiences is relevant given my earlier points about how our initial conceptions of flourishing and moral standards are inherited from the cultural and social environment in which we're raised. The wisdom is metacognitive insofar as it involves cognitions such as reflecting, endorsing, revising, rejecting, applying, integrating, and so on. With regard to these social-cultural influence beliefs about what living well consists in, along with the moral standards that should be guiding us. The CWM further focuses on perspectival forms of metacognition, PMC, claiming that types of PMC such as, quote, recognize the limits of one's knowledge, being open-minded to diverse perspectives, and being willing to consider ways to integrate them theoretically, function as bias-correcting checkpoints, enriching a person's understanding of the situation at hand, end quote. Some of these forms of metacognition are similar to intellectual virtues, such as open-mindedness and intellectual humility, perhaps even curiosity and epistemic justice. These seem like plausible candidates for metacognitive skills that would be relevant for exercising wisdom in the sense of revising our conceptions of human flourishing and virtue, as well as integrating those with our life projects and daily activities. The CWM highlights how these forms of perspectival metacognition are related to moral aspirations, claiming that, quote, PMC is required to implement wisdom-related moral aspirations. On their own, moral aspirations are abstract concepts void of the pragmatic nuances necessary to implement moral concerns in a person's life, end quote. I mostly agree with these claims, although I think our upbringing likely furnishes us with somewhat fleshed out conceptions of these abstract concepts to apply. But such conceptions are already probably somewhat rough in formulation, probably in tension with other values, and we're likely aware that others have conceptions different from our own. Thus, we can see the relevance of forms of PMC for considering alternative possibilities and revising and further specifying our conceptions of living well in the virtues. So if we think of moral aspirations on the metaphor of a moral compass, we need to calibrate that compass to make sure it's pointing us in the right direction in the first place. So again, success in achieving these moral aspirations, once wisdom clarifies them, depends on general self-regulatory abilities and on one's degree of skillfulness with respect to the virtues. Now, switching to the Aristotelian phronesis model, this is also a metacognitive model of wisdom, but with a more explicitly Aristotelian view of objective morality, combined with a more extensive set of functions for practical wisdom or phronesis to carry out than we see on CWM. This model is more ambitious, which I think is going to be seen as a strength to some, but as a drawback to others. I take the uniqueness of the APM that resides in the claim that there are 4 functions to wisdom: a blueprint, constitutive, integrative, and emotional regulation function. The function that's most related to my account of wisdom is their blueprint function, which refers to, quote, the agent's overall understanding of the kinds of things that matter for a flourishing life, the agent's own ethical identity, aims, and aspirations, their understanding of what it takes to live and act well, and their need to live up to the standards that shape and are shaped by their understanding and experience of what matters in life, end quote. So this suggests a blueprint of a flourishing life would then shape the sub-goals people set for themselves in aiming to live well. This appears to be along the same lines as my arguments that wisdom involves reflected upon and revisions of one's conception of living well and the virtues. Seems to me to also be a matter of goal setting, that is, thinking about the desirability, considerations regarding a flourishing life. By contrast, when it comes to the constitutive function of wisdom in the APM, this seems to me instead a matter of goal striving and the perception of salience that comes with skillfulness more generally and having more developmental models of the domain one is acting in. With this function, they claim that, quote, phronesis involves a cognitive ability to perceive the ethically salient aspects of a situation and to appreciate these as calling for specific kinds of responses. This ability can be cultivated and amounts to the capacity to read a situation by seeing what is most important or central, end quote. So this function is common to skillfulness in any domain, and so would be part of what it is to become more skilled with respect to individual virtues. For example, a skilled chess player can be as better at reading a board situation than a novice, as well as being better at preparing moves in response. So whether someone reads a situation correctly is requiring a kind, honest, or courageous response would likewise depend in part on the extent to which they've developed those individual virtues. But the question of whether to commit to a goal is quite distinct from the question of how best to achieve that goal once you've committed yourself to it. For example, the question, why be honest, will have a different answer from that of how can I tell what honesty requires in this specific situation. An exercise of wisdom can provide a specific conception of honesty as a goal to aim at realizing, but it's in the development of the virtue of honesty that one learns how to strive for this goal and realize it in different situations. So I think correctly reading a situation as requiring an act of honesty would be an exercise of the virtue of honesty and should not be considered itself an exercise of wisdom, even though there was a prior exercise of wisdom in setting an appropriate conception of honesty to be realized. So the division of labor between wisdom and the virtues there. So I do have concerns about whether conceptualizing wisdom as having these different functions where some involve goal setting, others goal striving, as to whether or not this makes sense for a singular ability or trait, given the different targets of setting versus striving for goals and the different processes involved with them. I'm worried that it sort of blurs the distinction between wisdom and the moral virtues, given what I've suggested as that division of labor between them. The integrative function of the APM is harder to pin down because it initially appears to describe processes relevant for goal setting, but then also brings in aspects of goal striving. In this function, quote, through phronesis, an individual integrates different components of a good life via a process of checks and balances, especially in circumstances where different ethically salient considerations or different kinds of virtues or values appear to be in conflict and need to negotiate to limit space. Then they continue, concluding that this function allows a person to engage in the adjudication of moral matters when conflicting desiderata arise, end quote. On the one hand, integration appears to involve a refinement of what one's goals are, and it could function in connection with the blueprint function when there's a conflict between conceptions of virtues, say, with respect to what conception of honesty or compassion one is trying to realize to settle a putative conflict between them. Now, this kind of goal setting or refining activity likely happens in times of reflection, especially if you're doing so with reference to your larger project of integrating your values. But to the extent that the latter part of the integrative function sounds like it might be working in conjunction with the constitutive function, insofar as the constitutive function is about perceiving ethically salient aspects of the situation, and it's suggested that the integrative function is needed when there are different ethically salient considerations. If so, then I take it this is related to goal striving, And so this integrative function seems to, again, bring in two distinct types of processes. The fourth function of emotion regulation seems to relate to the integrative function, at least insofar as it's a matter of dealing with potential conflicts between virtues. With this function, they claim that, quote, a front of us engages in reason-responsive decision-making by infusing emotional experiences with reason. The emotional motivations phronesis feeds on from the moral virtues may lead in conflicting different directions. For example, the pain of pity may clash with the pleasure of satisfied indignation when an evildoer receives comeuppance, or the relevant emotions may be disproportionate to a holistic assessment of the situation. End quote. The references to having conflicting motivations stemming from the virtues, which might lead to an improper assessment of the situation, makes it sound like this function works in conjunction with the integrative function and helping to avoid conflicts that would otherwise occur during goal striving, where the conflict stems from one's emotional reactions. The emotional regulation function is just getting one's emotional reactions in sync with one's cognitive judgments by infusing emotions with reason. But the inclusion of this function adds to the existing concern that processes of too many different types are being ascribed specifically to wisdom. I take it emotion regulation is a general self-regulatory ability and is important for being effective in the pursuit of any goal, moral or otherwise. But we generally don't theorize such domain general abilities into our conceptions of a particular ability or skill. For example, a lack of emotion regulation may interfere with your ability to acquire the skill of playing chess or to be playing in matches, high pressure matches, but we don't typically describe the skill of chess in a way that includes this kind of general self-regulatory ability. So I would argue that it's apt, as noted on the common wisdom model, that, quote, working definitions of wisdom rarely include emotion and self-regulatory characteristics, end quote, as such characteristics are needed in general as a goal-directed being and not solely for displaying wisdom. Now, in their defense, proponents of the APM suggest that a model of wisdom should be evaluated by, quote, how well suited it is to make sense of and in some context predict human emotions and actions and facilitate fruitful interventions, end quote. Furthermore, they claim that an advantage of the APM or the CWM is that it better accounts for moral motivation. They argue that, quote, one would have expected the main focus of the CWM to be on how it explains and predicts actual wise actions, rather than on what it tells us about the nature of wise thinking, abstracted from actual performance, or about people's varyingly transparent conceptions of themselves as wise agents, end quote. I agree with the APM that explanation and prediction are important, and the CWM is underdeveloped in this respect. And so I think what we need is an in-depth understanding of moral motivations. But I'm going to suggest that we should look to goal theory and self-regulation theory to understand many factors that are relevant to understanding moral motivation. So here I think it's important to emphasize that goals already provide motivation. That is, to be sincerely committed to a goal brings with it some level of motivation to try to achieve it, that is, to reduce the discrepancy. So when our actions aren't aligning with our goals and values, this is likely the result of a failure of more general self-regulatory abilities. Furthermore, it matters very much how these goals have been formulated, as that affects what specific kinds of behavior we will be motivated to display. And I've written on some of these elsewhere, but we'll only have time to briefly comment on them today. For example, one would expect problems to arise if moral standards are viewed as merely externally imposed standards for which failure to comply is punished, as this is unlikely to encourage people to place much desirability on the maintenance of such standards. Furthermore, a concern that Batson raises is that if moral standards are seen in this externalized sense, then people may adopt a goal to only appear moral, which he refers to as moral hypocrisy, rather than having a goal of actually being moral. Self-determination theory makes a similar distinction regarding whether standards are endorsed as part of one's core self or whether they feel imposed on one from external sources. SDT distinguishes between autonomous and controlled motivation, where the difference is whether the perceived locus of causality is internal, that is, stemming from one's own interests and values, or external, that is, stemming from the demands of others. With these distinctions, virtues would be characterized by internalized and autonomous commitments to virtuous activity. Even with sincerely endorsed goals, though, a further relevant distinction in self-regulatory theory concerns whether someone's focus is on promoting a desired outcome versus preventing an undesired outcome. A prevention-focused goal implies maintaining one's existing state, and so monitoring to prevent losses relative to that state. By contrast, a promotion-focused goal implies trying to improve upon one's existing state such that one focuses more on gains and progress. Virtues, like skills, would require having a promotion focus to motivate improving upon one's degree of virtue or skillfulness. since these represent ideals that one is striving to embody and which require experience and deliberate practice to develop. For example, a promotion-focused goal of being kind involves striving to become a kinder person, whereas a prevention-focused goal might instead be just avoiding any action that would count as cruel. So this distinction in focus can motivate very different behaviors, despite the goals both being concerned with kindness. Finally, whether goals are formulated as prevention or promotion focus might be influenced by beliefs that one has about the development of their abilities. So Dweck and Leggett's work on intelligence, for example, shows that people fall along a spectrum with respect to how they view abilities. Either it's a fixed entity that you cannot do much to change, or it's more malleable such that you can train to improve it. And there's evidence that suggests people can have these mindsets about moral abilities as well. And I've discussed this elsewhere in the context of the belief in the true self as essentially morally good. These two mindsets, fixed versus growth, have different consequences for how we react to failure. A fixed mindset leads to maladaptive responses because of feelings of helplessness to do better, whereas a growth mindset can lead to adaptive responses where a person puts forth effort to learn how to act better the next time. Furthermore, these mindsets have implications for goal setting. Fixed mindsets encourage the adoption of performance goals in the sense that the goal is to demonstrate to oneself or others that one has a certain level of ability. Since one primarily wants to avoid being judged as lacking, this suggests a prevention focus. Growth mindsets, by contrast, encourage the adoption of learning goals, where one is attempting to improve one's ability, and this suggests, in turn, a promotion focus. Skills are also good examples of abilities we associate with malleable mindsets and learning goals, and likewise for virtue. So if we want to have a better account of why our actions might often depart from our considered moral judgments, and we want to be able to better predict when people might engage in moral actions rather than morally disengage, then we'll need to attend to these and other differences in how goals are formulated. Now, I think the CWM has done some job in noticing some of these distinctions. For example, they draw a connection between having aspirational goals and having a promotion-oriented regulatory focus, as they point out that, quote, a notable difference in psychology between the duty-oriented deontological morality and the aspirations-oriented virtue ethics concerns a regulatory focus on visual maintenance of duty and that which is morally right on the one hand, that is prevention motivation, and the focus on eager process towards virtuous, morally excellent behaviors on the other hand that express personal flourishing, that is promotion motivation. Now, granted, while I don't think either wisdom model discussed so far draws ties between motivation and all the goal dimensions I've discussed so far, I assume that all of these things are consistent or amenable with their accounts. So you might view these as sort of friendly amendments. While having a promotion focus is necessary to realize moral aspirations, it's also a more effortful path, and there are important implications that stem from the fact that we often grow from adversity by learning from our mistakes. I've argued this elsewhere, noting how skills are improved by practice, specifically deliberate practice, where you try to improve by correcting past mistakes, overcoming your current limitations, and learning how to tackle new challenges. If you don't, you remain at a fixed level of skill development. The same applies to virtue acquisition, as moral failures will be a part of anyone's life, and learning from these painful experiences will be important for moral development and likely wisdom development. So increasing our skillfulness in virtue will require that we can acknowledge those failures and learn from them by making genuine attempts to improve ourselves. However, this is often difficult in practice, given that failure of any kind can be distressing, especially so for moral failure. If intense distress is created by a recognition of moral failure, this can prompt responses of anger, avoidance, or disengagement, rather than attempts to make amends and to work on self-change. While one typically ought to be feeling some distress in response to one's own moral failings, being able to acknowledge failure without that becoming too distressing can be a difficult line to walk. And the dynamics of this has to do with at least two roles that affect and emotion play in self-regulation. First is a motivational role affect can play in helping us to act consistently with other goals and standards. As Bandura explains, quote, self-regulatory control is achieved by creating incentives for one's own actions and by anticipative affective reactions to one's own behavior, depending on how it measures up to personal standards, unquote. In general, when we achieve goals or uphold moral standards, this feels good. But if an act we're considering taking or have already taken would violate our moral standards, this can trigger feelings of self-sanction, such as guilt or shame, which can either help to deter action ahead of time or if felt afterwards will hopefully prompt a different course of action in the future. Second, it's important to highlight that those affective reactions are a form of feedback about whether you are maintaining your standards or making progress towards your goal. So with respect to the second role, Carver and Shearer claim that, quote, emotions intrinsically are related to goal values and that they reflect differences between expected and experienced rates of movement toward or away from those goals. They represent an organismic monitoring of how things are going with respect to those values, end quote. In this sense, negative affect plays a crucial feedback role in alerting us that something has gone awry and signaling that we might need to take action in response. So overall, given that negative affect has a valuable feedback role to play, we have reasons not to seek to eliminate it. On the other hand, it's possible for such a negative affect to become so distressful that it undermines self-regulation and responding appropriately to the situation. So one becomes focused instead on the more short-term goal of getting rid of that negative affect. This potential for changing one's focus to reducing overly negative affect supports claims made about wisdom in both the APM and the CWM. The APM claims that, quote, people tend to make wiser choices on behalf of others than themselves, and that the most likely reason for this is that they are led astray by unregulated emotions directed at themselves, end quote. It also supports Grossman's claim that there are often a, quote, failure to reason wisely when facing self-threats, end quote. I view my arguments about the importance of learning from failure and the potential need for emotion regulation as supporting the view in the CWM that emotion, quote, that emotion regulation is not sufficient for wisdom, although in many cases good emotion regulation skills may be necessary to develop wisdom, end quote. That is, an inability to downregulate overly negative affect would likely to be an obstacle to acquiring and developing any skill or virtue, insofar as it switches our focus to a short-term goal of distress reduction at the neglect of other important considerations. Now, further questions are raised about the role of emotion with respect to wisdom by the authors of the CWM, who are forthcoming in stating that, quote, we deliberately avoided including emotions as a component of wisdom. After debate among the authors of our target articles, there was no consensus on their fundamental nature, the common wisdom model, end quote. In response, proponents of the APM recognize that one danger of including specific emotions in an account of wisdom is that, quote, if one includes one discrete emotion, rather than a more general capacity for managing emotions, why not more, or perhaps all reasonably expected or experienced emotions? However, that invites uncontrolled conceptual proliferation and threatens to turn wisdom into a synonym for the whole of proper psychomoral functioning. Its uniqueness as a meta construct is lost, end quote. I agree with the worries expressed here by the APM, though I've expressed my own worries that including the emotion regulation function specifically under the concept of wisdom already risks turning wisdom into, quote, a synonym for the whole of proper psychomoral functioning, end quote. Furthermore, I have some concerns that the account of emotion that the APM is operating with involves a problematic reason over emotion hierarchy in claiming that a wise person, quote, engages in reason responsive decision-making by infusing emotional experiences with reason, end quote. As reason infusing emotion implies this hierarchy where reason is the top, insofar as the relationship which seems to have only one direction, only reason infusing emotion, not vice versa. It suggests a potential independence of cognition, that is, from emotion. So for this and other reasons, I would advocate adopting a different kind of emotion to see how it ends up relating to wisdom. One suggestion for finding a better account of emotion is, I think, to look to enactivist accounts of emotion, which specifically reject any strict divide between cognition and emotion, and so it can bring out more explicitly the relationship between wisdom and emotion. I will draw briefly on my emotion appraisal theory as an example. On her account, the bodily and cognitive components of emotion are inseparable. Emotions are cognitive insofar as they involve appraisals of situation. So feeling fear indicates that your situation is likely dangerous. And these are felt in terms of bodily changes, for example, such as increased heart rate. Furthermore, as Mays points out, emotions aren't merely passive reactions to your situations, they are also preparing a response to it. For example, feeling fear also involves priming a response to the danger, such as fight or flight. In this sense, affect frames how you're viewing and responding to your situation. She also highlights how these emotional appraisals are connected to our needs, goals, and values. This point echoes the earlier claim by Carver and Shearer that emotions are intrinsically related to goal values. As the bodily feelings of emotion are registering something of significance in our environment, where the significance is relative to our cares and concerns. Features of the environment become salient to us because they could potentially support or threaten our needs, goals, or values. Maïs refers to this interaction between emotion and the environment as affective framing. As she nicely sums up, quote, "This is because emotions are essentially how minded beings like us care, how we care about objects, events, states of affairs, each other, our own lives, and even our own caring," end quote. Furthermore, Mays, in a discussion of transformative learning, brings out the interconnectedness of emotion and critical reflection, which might help illuminate the relevance of emotion for metacognition. She claims that, quote, "Reflectiveness involves directing one's attention to how one is thinking, behaving, and feeling in a specific situation. And which aspects of self-experience are deemed worthy of examination has much to do with an individual's cares and concerns. For example, if one does not care whether one's assumptions are racist, one will never direct attention to this aspect of one's thinking patterns." Goes on to suggest that the process of critical examination depends in part on taking up an affective stance of curiosity and openness that encompasses caring about one's relationship to others, being concerned about one's contribution to the world, and being sensitive and responsive to others' point of view, end quote. I think this would imply a tight connection between virtue and emotion, insofar as our moral goals would shape our emotional appraisals of situations, given that they represent our deeply held cares and concerns, as well as helping to prepare appropriate responses. Now, just to dive a little further, in the final part here, I think predictive processing models of the brain and cognitive science, such as those described by Andy Clark, as lending further lines of support to Maïs's account and some of my other claims regarding self-regulation, skillfulness, and virtue, while also providing helpful expansions to these ideas. So predictive processing models present perception, cognition, emotion, and action as integrated in some fundamental aspects. In brief, predictive processing theory suggests that the brain is actively generating predictions about what we should expect to experience in terms of sensory input on the basis of mental models. Our perception of the world is structured by these predictions, rather than it being the case that we first sort of receive sensory input and then try to make sense out of it later. The brain is attuned to detect errors in these predictions by comparing the expected sensory inputs to what we actually experience and updating our mental models accordingly in order to minimize future prediction errors. Furthermore, this theory gets extended to account for action, insofar as another way to minimize prediction error, besides changing our predictions, is to take action to change the sensory inputs to match our predictions. In other words, we act in ways to change the world so that matches up with our expectations. What's worth highlighting here is how predictive processing models view emotions as also integrated with cognition and action. On this, Clark claims that predictive processing accounts of emotion belong, quote, in the same broad camp as the so-called inactivist accounts that reject any fundamental cognition-emotion divide and that stress continuous reciprocal interactions between brain, body, and world, unquote. Predictive processing accounts seem to generate similar claims about the function of emotion as on Maïs's account. For example, regarding emotions involving situational appraisals and preparedness for action, Wilkinson et al. Claim that, quote, felt emotions thus integrate basic information about bodily arousal with higher level predictions of probable causes and preparations for possible actions, end quote. On such accounts, there's no clean divide between emotion, cognition, and action. In connection with Maïs's claims that emotion registers our cares and value, Ritter and Koff argues that from a predictive processing perspective on emotional appraisals that, quote, the central appraisal is whether an event is assessed as promoting or obstructing one's concerns. Concerns relate to norms, preferences, interests, to whatever affects the presence, availability, or intactness of everything the individual cares about, end quote. This connection implies that emotions will be central to wisdom, given wisdom's focus on our deeply held values and concerns, which is living a flourishing life and realizing our moral aspirations. Finally, a further implication of situational appraisals being related to our cares and concerns is that this serves to filter all that we might potentially experience in our environment so as to know what is or what isn't worth paying attention to. Now, Mays referred to this as affective framing, but this might be representative of a more general implication of predictive processing accounts. As Clark points out, quote, rather than aiming to reveal some kind of action-neutral image of an objective realm, prediction-driven learning delivers a grip upon affordances, the possibilities for action and intervention that the environment makes available to a given agent, end quote. So what a situation affords will be shaped by our cares, concerns, and goals. That is, the values that might be realized or threatened in the situation. This also suggests that our mental models of domains are similarly affordance-driven. And relatedly, what possibilities a situation might afford are further shaped to some extent by our own abilities, skills, and expertise. I think some of the relevance of affordances for virtue theories, that's a way of cashing out perceptual metaphors that are frequently used in describing how the virtuous person knows what to do. So Dow, for example, claims that, quote, occasion by occasion, one knows what to do if one does, not by applying universal principles, but by being a certain kind of person, one who sees situations in a distinctive way, end quote. For example, if someone has internalized a sincere promotion-focused commitment to being kind, then we should expect this to influence their emotional appraisals of situations and whether they perceive situations as affording opportunities for kindness or pressures to be unkind. Someone without such a commitment wouldn't necessarily see the situation as affording the same opportunities or pitfalls. So our moral goals should be expected to shape our emotional appraisals and perception of affordances. This brings us back to earlier points about the structure of goals, for example, as whether they are promotion or prevention focused will impact what opportunities situations afford, and so how people will respond accordingly. Okay, well, that's all the implications I can afford to cover with my time today. So I'll wrap up and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Matt, for a great talk. So I guess there will be a lot of questions from our very rich audience. I can see you clapping your hands, but please raise your hands if you want to make a question. Okay, Blaine is first.
That was a great talk, Matt. Really appreciated it. You have an incredible talent for making things sound reasonable. And so I'm inclined to want to agree with you a lot. And then as I thought about it, it wasn't just that I was inclined to agree with you. I actually do agree with you a lot. And that comes as no surprise to you. We've talked quite a few times and we found tremendous common ground. And I think in your discussion of wisdom, you were very keen on locating common ground between your viewpoint from a skills perspective and a goal perspective, the CWM and the APM. And I think it's actually true that there is probably more commonality than difference. The differences are also important. I think that's, I appreciate you pointing those out too. I'm in the odd position of wanting to defend the APM a little bit. And I want to not be defensive about that. But what I do want to say is I think part of what happened with you, given your familiarity with the psychological literature, I think the term we used, emotional regulation, is one that can mislead people pretty easily. I think it maybe led to some confusion on your part about what's meant by that. Well, anyway, I would not have used that term for the same reasons that you found it problematic. And that is that it implies a reason-emotion divide, and it implies a hierarchy, neither of which we think are true. So we're more in line, much more in line with the enactive approach that you talked about. And the goal is really to integrate reason and emotion. And one of the ways you do that is through reappraising situations when your emotions seem somehow misguided or extreme or inappropriate. So it's not as though we're just kind of managing this emotional beast that we are riding. It's more that our emotions are part of how we appraise situations. And the best appraisal is going to lead to the best kind of emotions, which is going to contribute to the best kind of behavior. So in that sense, it's very similar to what you're talking about. And I think you're absolutely right. I don't think we say it as much as we should, that emotions influence our thinking as well, because of course they do. This was a historic mistake in psychology. It went on for decades, that there was a perceived difference between emotion and cognition, and there was a lot of debate and argument about which one was the most important, either from the point of view of being most fundamental or being the most in charge. Well, that debate was entirely misguided, and I think most psychologists have concluded along the lines of what you say, is that there are really two aspects of our phenomenological experience. You can't really separate them except in a very abstract way. So I actually think what that means is there's a lot more commonality in your approach and the APM maybe than you even think.
Well, that's good.
It might be worth at some point exploring that. But I'm curious to hear how you might rethink some of the things that you've said in light of this, what I see as a bit of some corrective feedback.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you very much, Blaine, for that. And again, I tried to couch it as sort of in terms of sort of, it wasn't clear to me exactly what the emotion infusing reason was. And this is actually coming from a longer draft of a paper, but there I sort of note too, like I was also led to think of the hierarchy because there are examples given about how cognition can intervene on, like, emotion isn't, they make it clear emotion isn't, it has a cognitive element. That's how you can cognitively intervene on it and so forth. But there was never any suggestion that cognition had an emotional element to it as well. And so that sort of omission left it open to interpretation. And again, some of the language, I think it was just unfortunate about, again, it just that infusion and that regulation that all made it sound like a top-down sort of thing. So without just going by off of that, that's why I was worried about it. So I think if on this, that's great, because that's further consensus that this is what we want is a sort of an activist approach and so forth. And that you can't really ever pull these things apart. There isn't really cognition without affect and emotion. There's not emotion and affect without, again, depending on cognitions and appraisals and so forth. So so that just helps me articulate that in general. I still would maintain. I would just
add briefly that this is just an enormous legacy issue. There's a huge legacy of the divide and the top down. And I think it even plays a role in the ways that we wrote about it. So some of the, I would admit to some contribution to that interpretation. It's really helpful to hear back that that's what comes out of that, so we can write better next time.
Good. And I found the same problem too. Like once I stumbled upon the inactivists, and I started, I actually like had an article, got feedback, and somebody thought the same thing. Even though I tried to endorse the inactivist account, they said so many points at which you say things that sound like you're reinforcing the divide, and it's hard to sort of you grow up thinking of that divide, and it's hard to sort of retrain your thinking and how you describe it and saying, no, I didn't mean that. But when I look and I see it's like the reviewers' comments, I was like, all right, yeah, clearly I could see how I keep using that language, which reinforces it. So yeah, it's difficult to get past that legacy, even once you sort of realize it's there and make sure that you're consistently describing with it. So thank you very much for that.
Next in line, Howard.
Thank you. I'd like to second the applause for this talk and then ask a question kind of along the same lines that Blaine asked, although probably much less well-informed. I'm wondering if the distinctions you make between your own view and the APM are really distinctions about how to divide up faculties, rather than distinctions about what's actually going on in a person's head. So my question then is, do you disagree about what's going on in a person's head? Or is it just that you want to divide things up differently? I mean, I can understand that there's a reason to divide things up correctly and so on. So I'm not saying that that's a trivial matter, but I'm just wondering if you're disagreeing about what actually happens.
Good. I may be doing a little of both, but I guess I'll put it this way. I am putting my emphasis on dividing the faculties because I think it's very important to know that, especially from thinking from a skill point of view, if you're training and you're trying to engage in practice, you have to differentiate the skills, like what it is, where is it that you're having failings? Having a failing in emotion regulation ability and trying to grapple with that would be quite different from dealing with a failure, say, of, that might be related to your practice of honesty, say. So I think it's important, again, from the skills perspective and thinking about training practice interventions. Like we have to correctly identify where the problems are, such that it's very important to divide these out. And so that's one issue, but I guess part of what I also do, and the reason I structured my presentation the way it is that I think it's easy for people to start with. I see a tendency for a lot of times for people thinking about wisdom, about thinking about everything that could possibly go into being wise. Well, you know, you have to have the right values, and then you've got to know how to react the right way in every specific situation. And then you got to make sure that your emotions aren't getting out of control, but then you've got to be related to other people in the right, like they package in every possible thing. And so, you know, if wise action is sort of like the height of our goals, and you start there, you immediately build into your concept of wisdom all sorts of things that are really distinct, different concepts, different processes, not necessarily related to them all. You could develop one quite well without having developed the other at all, you know, and so, but you wouldn't normally get those sort of implications if you wrapped it all under the concept of wisdom, as if it's a singular trait or ability that you're training up and so forth. So my arguments are all to say, look, we got to think about what just being a goal-directed being is like in general, what sort of general self-regulatory abilities we expect any normal adult human being to have, you know, the things that go about when we're trying to acquire skills in order to really act well in domains of complexity. And then basically at that point say, okay, what distinct role can we see there then for wisdom that hasn't been already addressed? So we know that what wisdom is doing specifically for us. And I guess I'll just push one further point is part of my hope, I think, is that to bring attention to the fact that I don't think we've got as anywhere near good a handle on how to make apt value judgments and make some of these value trade-offs than we do with things like instrumental reasoning and effective means and strategies, and doing things like goal striving, like use of implementation intentions. And there's some stuff out here that what's really worked well, what we know in terms of strategies and training. And so that's another reason for me to try to highlight what wisdom's doing specifically, is to say, I think this is the part that has received, you know, it's crucial to wisdom, but hasn't received enough attention that about how we can do this well. So does that help?
Yes, thank you very much. That's very helpful.
Great. So now we have Monica Argold.
Yes, hi, Matt. Thank you. Very great presentation, and very comprehensive. So I'm not sure if I got it all, I have to say. I just want to mention one thing. When we talk about emotions, it's like, it seems to be as if we throw this in, you know, emotion is emotion, but I think there are differences in emotions. And, you know, we'll kind of promote a little bit my three-dimensional wisdom model, where I think the compassionate dimension is very important for wisdom. And so this, and you mentioned this caring attitude, you know, this positive affect toward others, compassionate, sympathetic love for others, I think is an essential part of wisdom. Emotion regulation, I think, is important in terms of the destructive emotions, you know, hatred, anger, and this kind of things, jealousy. So I think a wise person, if these kind of destructive emotions are coming up, would try to regulate these emotions and not to react to them, but, you know, to basically, this is where the reflective dimension of my model comes in, you know, looking at the things from different perspectives and basically observe, well, where does this emotion come from, and rather than just reacting to it. But on the other hand, I think a wise person is characterized by this compassionate, caring emotion. So it's, for me, this is an important aspect of wisdom. So I wonder how this fits into your model.
Good, thank you. So for the compassion part, I think part of what we're identifying here is that we do think, as a matter of making apt value judgments, that essentially the lives of other people matter, and that we are inherently social beings and interdependent and interconnected, and that we should appreciate this and value this and cherish this and be concerned for the well-being of all. I think that, at least as a considered value judgment, I think has a lot of good support for it. Insofar as, again, your sort of your own goals and you see your own identity that way. Again, the thought then is that's going to reflect, again, the way that you see situations, the way you react to situations, such that when somebody's, for example, in need, you'll see this as a situation for affording compassion and kindness. You presumably wouldn't react with indifference as somebody who really was totally self-centered would, where they would just see that as the situation affords, like helping someone at my expense, right? They'll see it that way. So I agree with you with the idea about making that apt value judgments about what a flourishing life consists in. It's got to involve that appreciation and valuing of us as social beings and interconnectedness. And that should give rise, because of those goals, to compassionate, again, seeing situations in terms of affording compassionate responses and so forth, and motivating us to act accordingly. With the destructive sort of emotions, again, I think there, what I do try to, I do try to promote the idea that negative affect by itself is crucial for us living. That is, it provides crucial feedback about when things are going wrong, like, whether it's just sort of the feeling fear, or you've got a guilty conscience because you're being aware that you're thinking about doing something dishonest or maybe unkind or unfair or something like that, and that's being brought to your attention. And so all the affect I view as basically, again, forms of the sort of that cover-shear model, sort of as forms of feedback relative to your goals and so forth. Now, again, so I think that's why I say we don't want to eliminate this. We want to pay attention to this stuff. But again, difficult line to walk, because sometimes a lot of that, what that negative affect is sort of a call for action that we need to change things and so forth. But that negative affect can build up to where it's so distressing that we get consumed by it. And that's, I think, where it becomes what you mentioned is sort of destructive. And then suddenly we're acting in ways where we're just trying to sort of dissipate that negative affect as quickly as possible, without consideration of how others are impacted, and often without regard to how we're impacted either. It can be as destructive as others, as well as self-destructive. And that's where I think, again, we need emotion regulation in that sense of again, keeping that negative affect in limits and being able to have strategies to deal with when that negative affect is building up, so that it doesn't consume us, but we don't lose some of the messages that we're receiving, that feedback that we're receiving. Again, I think because of emotion of that emotion regulation in that sense is, again, just part of being human, part of being goal-directed being, given that we have a feedback mechanism that relies on affect, and again, that it's reflecting our goals. And so I think we need that to be wise and to do basically anything effectively, essentially. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Very well. Now there's Cassie's question.
Hello. Again,
Hello.
Thank you very much for the talk. That was fabulous. So a couple of ideas that seem to have been popping up continually are this idea of how do we divide up the faculties that are ascribed to wisdom, and then also this idea that wisdom is a virtue, and insofar as it's a virtue, it's a trait. So, quick clarifying question, and forgive me if this is a basic question, but do you think that wisdom is a trait? And if so, what would you say are the implications of it being a trait for how the faculties are divided up?
Good. So let me get a roundabout response to your question. One, I'll note, I think Maria Sylvia brought this up in a previous talk on wisdom, that another reason for isolating what's unique about wisdom and sometimes being separating out the faculties and so forth is some philosophers like Christian Miller and psychologists like Daniel Lapsley have questioned whether we actually need a concept of wisdom. That is, whether it doesn't just sort of reduce down to all the other faculties, and that we might basically say, like, everything you're ascribing to wisdom is carried out by other faculties that are needed, sort of, again, independently. Like, you need emotion regulation independently. It's not just considerations of wisdom that would make you think that. And actually, Christensen and Blaine, in a recent defense that I didn't have time to go into in this talk, are responding to those sort of worries about practical wisdom and limitativism, as well as some other worries, again, about you might have the opposite concern. If you build everything into wisdom, there's nothing left for individual virtues as traits, essentially. If wisdom is your singular trait of just getting it all right, well, then that's all you need. So there are these, again, I didn't have time to get into this. So there are these other debates that are being played out too. And again, some recent responses to that by some of the wisdom defenders of these wisdom models. So that's another reason to try to individuate. But to come back to your question about virtue as a trait, I guess I've always been since I've had virtue as a skill, I haven't gone usually into trait-like language, in part because I don't want to associate it with like personality traits like the big five, because I don't think it works like that. But some people have argued that basically one way of understanding a trait, this could just be an enduring goal. That is, if you think about goals, about wanting to be an honest person, and that this is an enduring kind of goal. It's not like a bucket list thing that you check off. Yep, was honest. But again, a way in which you're trying to act and trying to find ways to grow progressively and become a kinder person or a more honest person and so forth. And again, since these are shaping, again, your values, your cares, your concerns, therefore these goals are shaping your perception of affordances in situations, what you're motivated to do. And to the extent that these are enduring goals over time, that might give rise to sort of trait-like behavior. But again, I have, for reasons, just sometimes steered away from the trait-like language. But that's my sort of way of understanding how you would get sort of that stability, some stability and consistency in sort of attitudes, habits, dispositions across time. Is because you've got enduring goals that are motivating you to perceive situations in particular ways that provide you with emotional reactions and feedback in various ways, and that because those goals stay stable, so do some of those behaviors and reactions. Does that help?
Yeah, that does. I was also kind of to follow that up with Snow and colleagues' recent model using whole trait theory to explain practical wisdom. Do you have any thoughts on, because what they're doing at that point is they're trying to explain the relationship between virtue and practical wisdom in terms of how the faculties involved in the explanatory side of traits or the social cognitive side of traits then result in patterns. And so do you think that your model of practical wisdom or of wisdom maps onto that at all? Anything about wisdom relates to the other virtues in terms of creating a pattern of virtuous behaviors, or what would you say about your model in relationship to Snow and colleagues' model?
Good question. Don't know. I haven't. One piece at a time. I haven't yet tried to see how. And there are other models of wisdom that I are sort of on my to-do list that I'm like, I need to delve into those more and see, again, as I've kind of tried to do with these recent wisdom models. So I don't have much of a response right now. Though again, I haven't been motivated by some of from what I understand, motivate some of the whole trait theory about how to try to find, coming out of the situation as critique, undermining the thought that we have stable traits and saying, well, the whole trait allows you to show that over an extended period of time, there's some consistency, even if there's, dips and valleys in that sort of behavior, but still from a different, broader perspective, when you zoom out a bit, you can see the sort of consistency that came under doubt with sort of the situation as critique. Again, I guess it hasn't been some of my project to try to rescue concerns about the cross-situational stability in traits. I suppose I also sometimes am a bit more of a pessimist about how well we actually embody some of these goals, and that we might need to do a lot more work before we should expect to see greater cross-situational stability and so forth. So I think some of them haven't motivated me in the same direction yet, but it is something I need to attend to. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Any other questions? Or I could take advantage of okay, Claudia. No, I won't.
Okay, so thank you very much. I would like to ask you so many questions that of course I cannot, but I will limit myself to two very quick questions, very small ones, on two different parts of your talk. In the very beginning of your talk, you referred to wisdom in terms of a goal setting skill, if I can say like that, and also you refer to it as a virtue unifying skill. So I would like to ask you if, in your viewpoint, in your perspective, we can put these two tasks together by saying that wisdom, because sets goals and unify virtues, is in fact a skill enabling a sort of a prioritization of goods in terms of what we perceive as positive, so very generally speaking. And the second question regards again emotions that we have been discussing about in this discussion time. You said that emotional regulation is not sufficient for wisdom, but on the other hand, it seems to be necessary to develop it. So I would like to ask you if you conceive of this necessity as a sort of precondition, so emotion regulation as a precondition to develop wisdom or practical wisdom, if you want, or if you conceive of this necessity as simultaneous tasks, which means that you cannot help being at least enough emotionally regulated in order to go on in developing virtues and wisdom specifically. So it's a necessity in terms of a mutual relationship between them and a simultaneous task, or it's a precondition, the emotional regulation, in order to be virtuous and wise.
Okay,
thank you.
Great, thank you. I guess I'll tackle that in reverse order. So I think my account comes closer to what you're describing as a precondition. I don't think of them in terms of their development being simultaneous. Though again, I don't tend to think of emotion regulation vis-a-vis wisdom. That is, I think emotion regulation is just an aspect of being human. That is, and the fact that we have a feedback system that is affect, and that again, the negative affect is both important as a warning system for when things are going wrong. It motivates us to take action, to try to fix things, which is great. But again, for a variety of reasons, that negative affect might be overwhelming, and that's when you sort of get a problem. And so it's going to be hard to You know, in my article on learning from failure, I spend a lot of time discussing this idea that, you know, in order to make improvements in skill and therefore in virtue, you've got to be able to learn from your mistakes. But, you know, that's going to be distressing. But you need to be able to handle that, to manage that distress, not let it, again, not let it think that it may, you know, calls into question that you're a good person or that you're any good at this at all. You know, if you fail at a math test, you don't want to think, oh, I'm just too stupid to do any better, you know, like undermining ways in which that affect just makes you shut down or something like that. So there's ways in which we want to be able to interact with that affect to make sure that it's still doing its job and not diverting us into, you know, again, focusing only on stress reduction or just avoiding tasks because they might bring that negative affect. But I think we need that just period. That is that, again, just part of being human, part of being goal-directed being, part of how we're, you know, again, the cognition and affect and action all being united. I mean, that's just part of being who we are. So I don't see it as tied specifically to wisdom. So I do agree that you would have a difficulty developing wisdom if you lack good emotional regulation skills. It would make it difficult for you to learn from your mistakes and grow from adversity and so forth. But it would also interfere with you learning all sorts of skills that aren't wisdom, that aren't virtue, and really, you know, like again, if you shut down anytime you make a mistake or somebody brings something to attention because you get overwhelmed by feelings of failure or shame or something like that, it'll stop you from, again, learning all sorts of things and acquiring all sorts of skills and so forth. So it's not unique to wisdom. Does that help answer the necessary, not sufficient?
Yes, thank you. It's much clearer.
And then wisdom in terms of goal setting skills, virtues, unifying skills, sort of prioritization. Yeah, I think this has to deal with, again, thinking about our conceptions of a flourishing life, what kind of goods that it involves. So of course, not just virtue, but things like friendship, you know, and knowledge, and, you know, pleasure has its place and all sorts of things, and thinking about those goods in relation to each other. So I think it extends beyond just considerations of virtue. But again, you're trying to think about, again, all these elements that can contribute to a life lived well and how to prioritize them and to give, you know, sufficient time to each, or, you know, more colloquial things like trying to strive for a work-life balance. You know, you might think there's wisdom in trying to figure out those trade-offs in our commitments and our goals and so forth. So I do think it involves, I think, what I take you were gesturing at in terms of the prioritization and the goods involved in a well-lived life.
Thank you.
Great. Any more questions? Matt, I had a question about your view on eliminativism, but it seems to me that you maybe didn't want to enter that debate. But if you have any thoughts about, because it seems tricky, you know, if you can factor practical wisdom out, then you have a problem because it seems to disappear and be dissolved into its components. But if you can't, then it becomes like, as Dan Lapsley has it, either or some, you know, physical entity that we now know doesn't mean anything but a label, a useful label once, but now. So it's tricky, and I wanted your take, if any, on the issue.
Okay, good. Yeah, and I started getting into that debate because of Christian and Blaine's recent article on the thinking in terms of the metaphor of a decathlon. And so they're trying to respond to, you know, the Miller's and Lapsley's worry. So given that I was already writing on their model, and then I was like, okay, well, how can I incorporate this, and how do I react to that? So I definitely had thoughts. I was just, you know, already used up all my time. So I knew in advance I couldn't address this as a larger topic. But again, this is why I think you want a clean division of labor between wisdom and the virtues. That is, if you can, again, I feel like on my approach, because I'm going bottom up, I'm trying to see how much we can account for with other general self-regulatory abilities and other aspects of, say, that goes into acquiring skills and, intuitive effective action at that level. And then saying, is there something that we still need in order to be, living well that isn't accounted for by everything else? If I can do that, then I can show that wisdom isn't merely redundant. And so, and again, I think with those, again, with skills and so forth, you can adopt skills without necessarily entertaining those larger questions about living a flourishing life and so forth. Like they're not inherently about, again, the sort of goal setting with respect to a flourishing life, and maybe that prioritization of goods and how do you arrange all these things together. And so again, I think there's that need, and I also hope in drawing attention to it that I point out that these are different, trickier matters, I think, in terms of how do we go about doing this well, in terms of making these prioritization of goods, these trade-offs amongst values. Again, how do we go about knowing that there are other ways we could be living our lives, appreciating other people's perspectives, maybe changing the way we do things in response. Again, some of that perspectival metacognition element. And again, that does not seem to be something that's, again, carried out by any of these other functions. So I feel like at the one point I've both done, the hope, of course, is that I've been able to both identify something unique, so you don't want to eliminate it. But there's important division of labor, again, between the wisdom and the virtues, such that wisdom isn't playing the role that the virtues are. Like it's that sort of tree illustrated of like here's the flourishing, here's the virtues, but here are the constituent virtues. Like you're trying to figure out how to prioritize these and get more specific to get the targets that you're trying to aim at. And then, but going out and saying, okay, now I know I want to be honest, and I kind of have a rough idea of what that means. Realizing that in practice is going to take lots of effort and training and strategies and learning and trial and error and learning from experience and getting feedback and sharpening your responses and becoming more skilled. So I'm hoping that division of labor helps to address those twin things, but we'll see. We'll see what my reviewers will soon have to say about that.
Sure. Thanks. Perhaps the last question, because we don't want to take too much of an advantage of Matt's time. Angelo Capodonico.
Okay.
Yes, many thanks. I would like to, and again on wisdom, because I am very interested on the fact that you speak on wisdom and not on practical wisdom in the first part of your speech. What do you mean with wisdom? Again, do you mean something like Sophia of Aristotle, or because we call it wisdom also, no? And is in another way, may I say that now I can change my conduct, my way of life, or also what I am doing, because my worldview is changing. So there is also some a view of the world when I am acting now, and this is something that concerns also the goals of my life. So there is a top and if you like, something like Sophia, no, is acting on phronesis, because may we say something like this is. Do you agree with this view?
Okay, good, thank you. So yeah, I mean, in some respect, I like to think what I'm doing is, of course, talking about practical wisdom and in the sense of phronesis as Aristotle discussed it, though I'm not trying to reconstruct phronesis as Aristotle considered it and so forth. So I do think when you're mentioning like worldviews and so forth, I think this connects to our views about living a flourishing life, like our views about the world and our place in it. And so that, as again, some of what might force us. I mean, sometimes we can, of course, engage in some of this reevaluation of our own priorities and our own views, just on our own initiative. You know, sometimes perhaps maybe curiosity or something like that drives that. But a lot of times our worldviews get shaken up, and our normal patterns of living, well, like think about COVID, normal ways of living get disrupted, and we have to start rethinking about how it is that we're living and what our priorities and so forth like. And so those, I think, you know, that relates again to thinking about some of our goals and the priorities we assign to them. So I think in terms of that sort of wisdom is about changing those worldviews, and because again that shapes our views about what a well-loved life is going to look like. Hopefully, did that help?
Thanks.
Very well. I think it's time to wrap it up. And thank again, Matt, for a great talk and great discussion. It's been a great start to our series this year. So thank you again, Matt.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Let me just remind you that the next meeting will be on December 2, and we'll have as a speaker Monica Ardelt, who's with us today, and we'll remind you about the details and link to join us in this meeting. So thank you again to all of you, and especially to Matt again for a great talk.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you again.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.